All right, everyone, welcome back to Comic Talk, and today we're going to be talking about the about super strength. This is often a very interesting topic because a lot of databases, just for comic book cures and other websites like Wikipedia will, always list like super strength, like superhuman strength, said under some kind of character's list of powers, but they never, but sometimes it's kind of hard to determine what exactly um, essentially that actually means. Because sometimes they'll just say, well, it's slightly above what a human could do under normal conditions, or, being able to lift, something that weighs like a few tons, with not much effort. And this is often where a lot of things kind of get kind of confused. That, but if there's one thing you have to kind of take into consideration involving like totally superhuman, is the fact that we don't really know what a full empowered human could actually do. There's always, talk about the fact that we have a vast, say reserve of strength that we only use about 20% of at maximum. And I really couldn't find too much information about whether or not, an overpowered, bodybuilder who's definitely, muscles on top of the muscles, what would happen, if they're under an adrenaline surge? Would they gain anything extra because they have all that muscle behind them? Or or maybe in this case, because the muscles are already there, the body doesn't maybe produce as much um, adrenaline to actually produce it. And while in this case, adrenaline, is responsible for a lot of incredible, acts of strength, it's only meant to be done very, very short bursts. The human body just can't really take it. So even though you may see someone, lifting a car, to save a child or something, you know, if they wouldn't be able to say, okay, let's see how long you can hold it for, because the body can only has so much energy in it. So it's like kind of kind of like just a few moments out there, kind of like in the first Harry Potter movie where they said that the chocolate frogs only have one good jump in them, then they pretty much just become regular chocolate treats. So and there's always a lot of issue, a lot of weird kind of confusion when they always say, stronger than, 10 men. Well, the question is, what kind of men are you actually basing your, um, comparison on? Are you talking about men that are pretty much of average height and build, or are you talking about a mass, someone who is maybe not a bodybuilder, but just enough muscles that they could definitely be impressive? Because in this case, if you were to give such a strength, to a child that's only a fraction of that weight, then that would definitely be pretty impressive. But if you're talking about a similar person having the strength of 10, basically 10 versions of that, that's still a pretty decent amount. If the same, potential is lifting about 4 times your body weight, it does give you being able to lift 40 times your own body weight. But for me, they always say like stronger than 10 men. It needs to at least be a dozen. Um, a lot of things involving dozens are out there. You know, it's, uh, zodiac signs, months, number of apostles. It just kind of seems like that would be the standard, because if they don't say stronger than 20 men, there's a little bit of an area for you to actually show that, and you never know if if you're starting out as a strong child, what you'll actually be when you finally grow up, because you don't want to be someone you know that barely amounts to like 60 pounds and you're kind of stuck like that. Instead, because I always believe that every superpower when you first start out, is not going to be the defining version of whatever you have um, later on in life. It has a chance to kind of grow with you. That's kind of why I think with the X Men world, they actually said one reason why they would have like the idea of puberty is just the fact that that's when your body's going through so many other changes. That'd be the one time to make sure you get that jump start on everything. You don't want to be someone who's like 70 years old and they'd say yes, if you were younger you'd be able to lift 100 tons, but now you wouldn't be able to lift 10 tons for long. And I definitely would say that there are some issues actually with saying, well, this character has the ability to lift like 100 tons with only a basic amount of effort. And they don't really say what that kind of comparison is, because you get a spoon out of the drawer, and that barely only weighs about an ounce, and that's hardly any effort at all. Even if it's like something simple as getting the milk, like a gallon of milk out of out of the fridge or from the store, you definitely acknowledge that it's heavy, but it's not so heavy that you couldn't hold it, for a decent amount of time if you had to. So if someone was to basically, um, it would be incredibly strong, due to other circumstances like Thor. He's essentially not even human, so his muscle fibers are built very differently. Lifting a large amount, is said with little effort, might not actually be um, might not actually make him as powerful, as in terms of power to weight ratio, just because a lot of Asgard said they would make it seem like they're the same size as us in the movies, but in reality, like in the comic books, they're actually a lot taller and broader, and they're just denser. Some versions of Thor say he's about 600 pounds on his own, and he kind of towers over a lot of people. So he so in theory he just has a much more unique muscle fibers to actually have it. And then in comparison to what a standard peak Asgardian would have compared to a human might be different. So if you were to suddenly start giving him a power multiplier, it's going to be very different for him. So one character that always kind of bothered me in terms of super strength is actually Superman, because he always seems like he has all this strength at some points, and then quickly loses it, because there was the old school Superman cartoons from the 1940s. They actually showed the fact that at one point he actually had to fight a gorilla, and it seemed like there was quite a bit of a struggle on that. Like for some reason, the gorilla was not a normal gorilla; it was far more stronger than what it had, and Superman, was actually trying to hold it back. Like said, "Oh man, this thing's really difficult." Like if it was a human, and yet they actually showed him in Billion Dollar Limited pulling $1 billion worth of gold bars to the mint. And at the time, gold really was only about like $50 an ounce at that time for inflation, and essentially amounted to about 800 tons worth of gold. And if you consider the fact that they were stored in several cars, and then at one point he actually has to dive down off of a cliff because the tracks are broken, grabs them, and then picks it right back up, and quick, takes it the rest of the way. That's kind of strange. And yet, the bad guys actually showed him, and so actually threw tear gas at him, and Superman was like struggling. I mean, you honestly would think that if he has that much kind of power, that tear gas would barely do anything. It's like, yeah, we have to use 10 times the gas, just to get a few tears out of him. But if he just can't, keep up with other things, it just doesn't make any sense. And another interesting thing from the animated series was that he actually has a house key under the mat to the Fortress of Solitude, and it's supposed to be, it's at about a 500,000 pounds of dwarf star material, and he's able to kind of pick it up like it's just a regular key, like you don't actually, see him, having to pick it up with any issue, and yet it's actually just kind of sitting there. It's like just like a regular key, like it would weigh, nothing more. than a normal key of that shape and color. But something that dense, eventually will start to actually crumble into, um, instead into the ground. It's kind of like if you're going to be putting in a new bathroom or any kind of major appliance in your house. You have to definitely make sure all the boards are reinforced because at some point, they can only hold for so long. It may not happen immediately, as fate's cruel like that, but the idea is the fact that there's only so much strength each thing's kind of have, and once one part starts to buckle, you know, you know, it doesn't take much. And so I'm not entirely sure exactly how that key exactly would work. I mean, when they actually showed it in the Supergirl series, it was actually a pretty sizable, you know, um, object. It wasn't like a regular key. It was kind of like a batter, like I said, a golden battering ram with the L with the Superman logo on it. And yet, you know, it said later on in the series, this guy basically puts on a set of gloves that seems to nullify how heavy it is, and so he could essentially use it. So it really doesn't seem to make any sense, what the conditions are. Then again, they also show the fact that somehow um, plastic was said, especially designed plastic, or Toyman was actually able to keep Supergirl in place. And I'm thinking, okay, does it have any kryptonite in it? Because it's not. It's a they never really give a thing. It's like, okay, we just accept it, and yeah. Because even if you're talking about people in real life that seem to be very strong, you said on their own, you definitely would look at them and you would definitely would know that their muscles are far more developed. There's actually a guy that is able to balance a car on top of his head, but his neck is like just massive underneath it. He it's almost like he gain he loses his neck because it's actually so big. So in this case, for me, if you have so much, the idea is the fact of true super strength could be having the ability to lift an insane amount of power based off a bigger version of yourself, like a definite bodybuilder form, but you could actually be, fairly scrawny. So it's kind of like the idea of watching, seeing Batman and Robin on the side of the thing. If one was to show that, Batman was able to lift, something fairly heavy, but Robin was actually able to lift it, you know, about the same level of difficulty, then you know that Robin's a lot more potent. Because the idea is just the fact that you do want to be strong, like I said, and muscular to handle everything. Get your body used to having it. Said handling that kind of strength, but it kind of alienates you because there are some issues with having super strength. And one particular idea that comes to mind is the fact that you can't just touch someone very casually because a quick little tap, without any restraint, you know, could actually feel quite a bit more. It's almost like you punch someone, where you actually hit them. So if you don't really know how to control everything, that's a problem. So if you can basically lift, several thousand tons, you still have to kind of find that balance just to be able to say, oh, you said there's a cute little kitten right here. I'm going to pet it. I said very gently. Because that just always kind of bothered me. It was just like how exactly can they go up and down so much? I mean, it's not like these aren't the characters from Dragon Ball where they can just turn off their power. Some characters constantly have there's not really any on or off switch, for some of them. Like Superman, unless you basically suck away all of his energy, he's definitely going to be pretty said strong no matter what. You know, like even in this case, like in the old school Incredible Hulk series, the reason why he was actually shoving everyone, rather than actually fighting for real, is the fact that if a regular person even just took said a quick little tap, from him, it's going to be very, very painful. The Hulk's over 300 pounds. They showed the fact that there was a genetic component that can make someone very strong. So in this case, just a cat. So in this case, and you decrease the total surface area of impact when you punch someone if instead of just shoving it. As they always say, force is equal to mass times acceleration. In theory, is the fact that um, you're regardless of whatever you're actually able to do in terms of running or something, you're actually accelerating things very quite a bit. It's very much like the idea of saying, a cube, a simple cube of aluminum may only weigh about let's say not even a pound, and yet if you were to get something like tungsten, it definitely said looks exactly the same, said, but it feels so much heavier. So you don't really know. So if something actually had a hit, was hitting you, that's the difference. But there is definitely another particular idea that most people don't actually realize is that you do need some degree of heightened durability to actually handle everything um, in you. Because while in this case, the bones, so the body may be strong enough in certain circumstances, they can still be shattered pretty easily. And actually, the original Incredible Hulk series, they showed the fact that when a boy was, cracked an egg, it was there. They said it was regular eggs, but if he kind of cupped his hands and pressed it, it doesn't act. It said he couldn't actually break the egg, and if you actually stack, an egg with like two, like bottle caps on top of each other for balance, you can actually support quite a bit because everything is more spread out instead of having that focus. So if there's no point in being able to say, look, I can lift a car, yet in this case, if you can't, if your bones will snap like toothpicks, that strength is useless. And in theory, if you're going to be hitting someone with that power that might be durable themselves or like a robot, you want to make sure that you're not immediately going to put your hand out of commission for who knows how long. So, because you can say people that are under adrenaline surge, can do incredible things, but if they sustain any injuries on this one, it's like there was no superhuman attributes whatsoever. But other problems actually stem from the fact that you need to be able to balance with a very heavy load on top of your head. Um, Even if something's not incredibly heavy, something about the fact that you just can't get a good grip on it, or if it's a little lopsided, it wouldn't take much for you to just kind of tip over it and you lose it. Just kind of like, if you're trying to move something, um, you always kind of feel like it's different. Feels a little bit differently when two people are carrying it as opposed to one person, just because of the fact that you have that support, and the balance. And even worse is the fact that the ground below you also needs to be fairly strong as well, because there's no point. You said you could be having to lift something very heavy over an icy lake, and you're not entirely sure how thick the ice actually is, just because it might be, enough to actually for people to skate on is one thing. But if you actually have to pick up, something like a minivan, that's over there to move it, that minivan's probably, you said, might be pushing, the limit. So if you actually pick it up and you put all that weight is going into you, um, that's going to cause a lot more stress on the ice. I actually once saw a science experiment where if you take a bunch of paper cups, and you put one large piece of cardboard underneath it, and then one on top, you can actually be far more supported than if you just apply your full weight. I like, what type of walkers actually do walk, is that they often have those large poles for balance. They're just trying to basically shift everything. And in this case, when they would say, oh, this is they said a bed of nails would be terrible. It's like, well, it may be uncomfortable, But because multiple nails are supporting a specific area instead of one, you know, we're say taking your full weight, it's perfect. It's not nearly as bad. And then even the so it's one thing to definitely be very strong, but if your skin, and other tissues aren't nearly as potent, it's kind of like saying you may have the strength of 100, like 100 men, but if your physical durability hasn't been augmented enough, you might actually suffer. Because in like the Incredibles, it almost seems like Mr. Incredible himself is more of a invulnerability hero that happens to be um, equally as strong. That's why he's called Mr. Incredible. But if you're talking about someone like Luke Cage, essentially you would have to, like, only someone like Wolverine would actually be able to do anything against him because his skin is just insanely hard. I said, but they only really gave him the ability to lift about like 25 tons at maximum. So it's like saying he could take the impact from something that would be more on the lines of like 250 tons, but he doesn't actually put anything back. It's kind of like how some elements can be very hard, it said, but can be brittle in other areas because it's not entirely impossible to just go up to a diamond and just smash it with a hammer. It doesn't have that resilience, and if you actually heat diamonds up and expose them to oxygen, they immediately turn into carbon dioxide. So it's kind of like a serious trade-off. So yeah, I mean there can be some decent applications, for strength, such as if you're going to jump really high, you have that strength in your legs, and if you don't land right, you could might be able to, rely upon some durability to have everything. But the question is, what is said, how far do you really want to take it? Because you know you just never know if you can only lift like so many, like maybe about like 5 tons. You don't want to try to see if you can lift 7 tons, right away. You try to see how close you can get to 6 tons, and then go from there. Because you can add other things to make you stronger, kind of like like various prostheses, like Iron Man, could definitely be pretty potent on its own. But the idea is the fact that you're relying upon not inorganic materials with advanced servos, unlike someone like a symbiote. And the fact that they do have the ability to increase their mass, because they have a huge inner storage capacity to use everything, but they still have to be kind of hulking monsters. They said original Venom was about 800 pounds, but it was only able to lift about 25 tons. So that was, he essentially didn't even have the ability to lift 64 times his own body weight. And yet, in this case, all it said his offspring managed to get a lot stronger. It said mostly just because of the fact that they had Spider-Man's prenatal vitamins. It said in them, but it's one thing to basically have that kind of strength, but if limits are built in, you gotta, it said, and you can't overcome such limits. Don't volunteer yourself to lift, very heavy objects, because you don't want to be the person that has to, it said, say, hey, it said, can you move this tank for us? I'm like, and you're like, no. I said, I can't. I might be able to, push it a little bit, but not really like lift it. And sometimes you're not entirely sure what, other things we actually can do, because on Mythbusters, it actually showed that if you were to do a sudden, really powerful tug on like a rope or something, you would exert, like 10 times, the force to actually move an object. But if you were in a tug of war, you wouldn't actually be able to do about half your body weight. We're just not really meant for that kind of activity. Even certain aircrafts can only lift so much of their own body weight, and still be able to fly. Yet, something like an eagle actually can lift about 5 times their body weight. So everything is definitely built very differently. Because when they actually talked about, the shark from Jaws being insanely strong, they actually had, a pretty powerful tow truck just trying to see how much it would take to actually submerge those buoys that they put out, and the shark would have to be, massive, just to be able to have that kind of, strength just to be there. I mean, no, it's movie magic and anything can happen, but the you pretty much would need the shark to be the size of a blue whale, and that'd be very hard for people to just ignore. It's like, hey, what's if you see like the movie The Meg, that's definitely a decent size, but totally absurd. Mostly because of actually where they were in that kind of trench area, the change in pressure would be way too much, and you know, no matter, I said, you're not really going to work too well. So, but then again, there are always different types, different sources for superhuman strength because characters like Colossus. He's strong as a regular human, but he only seems to gain his powers, his real strength when he actually turns into um, his metal form. He said rather than someone like Spider-Man that you know he said he could be lift everything incredible without the need to actually transform. So I mean, look at Emma Frost. I mean, she actually has two totally different power sets. But the idea is the fact that she can be shattered fairly easily, and she can't actually use her psychic powers. And when you actually do transform into that, you're adding so much more mass behind you that even if your power to weight ratio is not that high, the fact that you could weigh quarter to half a ton, you know that's a lot of force behind you. So because you just never know what kind of powers you're actually going to get um, with that. So I could definitely would say, if you had to basically say what a bare minimum for, something might actually be possible, I would say take whatever, what you would be able to use under an adrenaline surge and at least double that. Because of the fact that, we only use about 20% of that, suddenly being able to lift, the full extent, if you lift about only like 16 times your own body weight, and at maximum you're able to lift 80, that's definitely one thing. But instead, the idea is the fact that it still may not be enough for some people, so you have to kind of, say, okay, this is how much, muscle I can actually put on and still be able to function, and this is the bare minimum weight I will be able to have and still be able to lift peak human abilities. So there's it's definitely more of a mess, with strength. The fact that you need to be more balanced, you need to have some durability. You got to make sure you don't hurt anyone, and yeah. So, but all in all, just having a little bit of strength, which could still be very helpful, because if you got elderly relatives that can't lift anything as much, if they just had the ability to function like they were when they were younger, he said there'd be a lot less worry. So, okay, he said our next talk will be that of super speed, and I've definitely had noticed, some very interesting things about that power. Um, so take care.